Welcome to House Judiciary Committee, Thursday, February 15th. Glad to have everyone here. We are just going to go ahead and get started. The first thing, we're going to have two bill hearings today, HB 2781 and HB 2782. I want to remind everyone that we're going to stay on the bills. We're not going to talk about things that don't have to do with the bills. And when we get to 2782, because we have a long list, I want to make sure we get to everybody. So we will have a time limit, which we'll let you know before we start the hearing on that one. Because we don't want anyone left out. So we're going to have to do a time limit. And my vice chair will be the timer. He'll be the bad guy today. I'm going to go ahead and open the hearing on House Bill 2781 and ask our reviser, Natalie Scott, to give us an overview.
Thank you, Madam Chair. House Bill 2781 allows compensation from the Crime Victims Compensation Board to be awarded for criminally injurious conduct and increases the amount that could be transferred from the Crime Victims Compensation Fund to the Crime Victims Assistance Fund in each fiscal year. Section 1 amends KSA 74-7305. That's the statute related to making application for compensation to the Crime Victims Compensation Board. Current law there provides that compensation for mental health counseling may be awarded to certain victims, and it also provides the time frames for when the claim has to be filed with the board. This bill keeps the categories of victims and the time frames the same, but removes the requirement that the compensation be awarded just for mental health counseling. Provision is also added to allow the board to award compensation when the board determines that denying compensation would be a severe injustice to the victim. Current law in subsection E provides that compensation may be awarded only if the board finds that unless the claimant is awarded compensation, the claimant will suffer financial stress. The statute lists the items for the board to consider when making that determination, whether the claimant would suffer financial stress. And this bill adds that the board can consider other factors deemed appropriate by the board when making that determination. Current law in subsection F provides that compensation may not be awarded unless the criminally injurious conduct was reported to law enforcement within 72 hours after its occurrence, or the board finds there was good cause for the failure to report during that time. This bill would add that compensation may be awarded if the victim obtains a forensic medical examination within 7 days after the occurrence of the conduct. And finally, in this section, current law in subsection H provides that compensation for work loss, replacement services loss, dependents economic loss, and dependents replacement service loss may not exceed $400 per week or the actual loss, whichever is less. This bill would change that amount to $800 per week or the actual loss, whichever is less. And additionally, compensation for work loss for a victim of human trafficking or aggravated human trafficking would be required to be awarded in an amount not less than $350 per week and not more than $800 per week. Section 2 amends KSA 75-752. That's the statute that authorizes the transfers from the Crime Victims Compensation Fund to the Crime Victims Assistance Fund. Current law there provides that that transfer shall not exceed $300,000 during each fiscal year. And starting in 2025, that transfer would be able to not exceed $500,000 in a fiscal year. And I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Committee and also audience, I forgot to mention that you can find all the testimony and everything on the web page. It was not emailed to you. Kathy's, like I mentioned, she's not feeling well. And so you did not get an email with all this testimony, but you can find it on the web page of the Judiciary Committee. It is there. Anyone have any questions or on that specifically? Okay. If you can't find it, let us know. And you all would be able to get on too if you wanted to look at the testimony. Okay, so now, does anyone have any questions for Natalie on her explanation of House Bill 2781? Okay, looks like we don't have questions. So we'll go ahead and call the proponents up. First, Kristen Zugala from the Office of Attorney General. And please tell me how to say your last name.
Sure. It's Chugala.
Chugala. Okay.
Kristen's
Thank
fine.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon and speak in support of House Bill 2781. You have my written testimony, so I'll only highlight just a few things that I think are of most importance to discuss today. One being that in 2022, United States Congress passed the Fairness for Rape Kit Backlog Survivors Act, which is requires that state crime victims compensation programs comply with the requirement to not deny claims for victims of sexual assault if they are otherwise eligible for late filing. If the reason that they filed late was due to a delay in the testing of a sexual assault examination kit or a delay in a DNA profile match. It is our office's assessment that our current statute does not comply with this requirement, which must be changed by March 2025. So our recommendation, we had an option to complicate this super complex piece of our statute, or what we ended up recommending, which is to kind of simplify that some and remove the mental health counseling only component of an approval for those types of claims and allow the board to approve those claims in full. One of the things most often victims in those types of claims are seeking our mental health counseling, but that limits the board to only being able to pay for those individual therapy sessions. So we are not able to cover medication management, mileage to and from those appointments, or the costs of mental health related prescriptions related to that because of the way mental health counseling is defined. So our recommendation is to allow them to approve those in full. I also wanted to touch on the piece about wage loss. We have proposed that you consider increasing the weekly wage loss cap from $400 per week to $800 per week. If a victim earns more than $400 per week, we are unable to pay any more above that. So they're only getting help with part of their wages that they lost during that time frame. This cap was last increased from $200 to $400 in 1998. So it has been some time since that was last increased. We are also requesting your consideration to approve lost wages for human trafficking victims. We came to the realization this last year that the way our statute reads and requires us to have documentation of actual loss, that we don't have a way to determine that. Generally, the documentation that we use to prove lost wages are W-2s, pay stubs, tax returns, and those don't exist in cases of human trafficking. So this would allow the board to pay lost wages to those victims of crime, even if we're not able to obtain that type of documentation for human trafficking victims. And lastly, I wanted to discuss the change in the transfer of funds to allowing the Attorney General to transfer up to $500,000 from crime victims compensation to crime victims assistance. These funds are used in Crime Victims Assistance Fund to fund 3 of the 6 awards that are provided to nonprofit agencies throughout the state of Kansas. Those grants are the Crime Victims Assistance Fund grant, the Child Abuse grant, and the Child Exchange and Visitation Center grant. In total, our office awards about $1.1 million towards our nonprofits who provide direct services to victims of crime. And the fund is primarily funded through a fee fund, and those funds have struggled the last few years. So being able to push a little bit more money into that fund, which ensures that the funds are still going to direct assistance to victims and survivors, will help stabilize that a little bit for us for our nonprofits who are experiencing cuts across the board from other sources. And then we did have a request for an amendment on the statute in subsection, since 74-7305 subsection D, there was a drafting error in the processing of this bill that moved the part that says this subsection shall not be construed to reduce or deny compensation to a victim of domestic abuse or sexual assault was separated from the previous sentence, which applied to unlawful activity. And the result of the way it was structured will result in double dipping for victims of domestic violence or sexual assault who recoup their losses from another source. So that was an unintended change in the drafting of this bill. So we are requesting an amendment to restore the way that that piece of the statute currently appears in the law. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, and we will wait for questions, but you don't know what page and line number that amendment was on, just so we can be looking at that?
Yes, I do. It is on page 3, and then we're looking at lines 6 through 17. So lines 16 and 17 were separated from lines 13, 14, and 15. Those used to read as one solid paragraph.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
We'll, if you'll stay, we'll hear the other proponents and then see if there's any questions. Thank you. And now we have Richard Samaniego from the Kansas Crime Victims Compensation Board. Hi, Richard. Welcome to committee. Nice to have you here from Wichita. Thank you for coming.
Honored to be here. Chair Humphreys, members of the committee. My name is Richard Samaniego. I'm chair of the Crime Victims Compensation Board. I've served in that capacity since 2018. Proud to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony on behalf of the board. For those that might not be familiar, the board's composed of 3 members. The other members are Stuart Height and Becky Dickinson. We just had a meeting this morning. We meet once a month here at the State House to approve claims, but also to have hearings for denied claims in a quasi-judicial capacity and hear directly from the victims. Of course, all credit goes to Kristen and her staff. They're on the front lines, the first point of contact with victims, filing claims and processing those claims. And we get it at the tail end with a lot of work that they've put into it. But in the process of hearing claims and also these hearings, we often note opportunities for change that would benefit the compensation process. I've presented before you all before on some of these requested revisions that would be helpful to processing claims for victims. And so I wanted to point some of those out. The board, obviously unanimously voted to support HB 2781, including the revisions presented by Kristen. And to avoid duplicating the testimony, I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the points that she's already addressed. Last year, we did come to you to increase the amount for the funeral expenses. Those, as Kristen noted, a lot of those changes had not been made since 1998. So we do thank you for last year approving that increase to $7,500. It's helped a lot of grieving families with the high cost, increasing cost of funeral expenses. But we're now coming to you to consider increasing the wage loss. Obviously, cost of living has increased, and victims who've experienced these violent crimes are unable to work. And we have this cap in helping them meet their daily needs. Right now, it's $400, and we're requesting that increase to $800. The second part of the request regarding the wage loss with the range for the $350 per week and not more than $800, Kristen mentioned, is just to give us a little broader discretion for those victims that may not have a set income, like human trafficking victims who cannot present pay stubs. They're usually working under duress or other kind of circumstances. So it gives us the discretion to consider those circumstances, dependence, and other factors. The proposed legislation will also remove an administrative barrier to the processing of claims. Under the current law, the compensation may be awarded only if the board finds that unless the claimant is awarded compensation, the claimant will suffer financial stress as a result of the economic loss. In making that determination, we have to consider and make a finding on factors that are specifically in the statute. And if we don't have the information to do that, we cannot make that finding. And as you might imagine, when a victim has gone through a horrible experience, getting us paperwork and supporting documentation is probably the last on their mind. And this really just gives us other factors to consider so the claim can be processed. Otherwise, it sits there until that information is obtained and the board cannot consider it. The other section I really want to point on, stress, is the discretion we're requesting to approve claim beyond the 2-year statute of limitations. Most claims under the Crime Victims Compensation Act are limited 2 years from the date of the crime. There's some exceptions for minors and sexually violent offenses, but for the most part, most claims are limited by that 2-year period of time. As we hear, if we deny a claim based on that statute of limitations and based on the annual report that if you haven't gotten already, you will get from the board, there were 12 claims that were denied last year based on the statute of limitations. Well, as the board, in hearing directly from the victims and what they've gone through, and compelling reasons why they were not able to do the 2-year limitation, as the board, wholeheartedly think it would help if we had some broader discretion to consider a claim, because in those cases, there's no doubt that that person is a victim. We have the information we need to do that. We just can't because of the 2-year time frame, and they often don't understand it. And there is obviously a purpose for statute of limitations, but in these cases, we have the information we need to make that determination and to help them, but we can't. So the bill simply provides that if we hear compelling reasons of severe injustice, we can go beyond that 2-year period of time. And one of the examples would be, for example, a domestic violence situation. If a victim is subjected to severe abuse from an abuser and is fleeing from that abuser, it often takes a long time to be in a safe position to participate in the legal system in the process. And they might not even get access to an advocate for many years. So they don't even know that they're eligible for assistance. And so in those situations, I think the board would consider that severe injustice to prevent them accepting a claim based on those criteria. So again, on behalf of the board, I just want to thank you for the consideration of our proposed legislation. I thought Kristen laid out the funding requests and everything else quite well, so I don't think I need to get into any more detail. But I do want to point again, once you do get this annual report, it does have a very concise list of all the eligibility requirements and all the stats from our board. If you get it before your desk, just take a look at it. It's very helpful, and it helps with constituents as well if they have questions about the compensation.
Okay, thank you. If you'll stay, if anyone has any questions for you, thank you for your service on the board too. Okay, committee, I'll now call Michelle McCormick from the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am Michelle McCormick. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We're a nonprofit organization and represent the 25 member programs across our state who provide direct services to victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I'll keep my remarks brief. You have the written testimony. I just wanted to say we're in support of this bill for several reasons. Most important for us is that we think that this gives the opportunity for the Crime Victim Compensation Board to balance, their stewardship for the resources that are in their charge, but also improve services to crime victims. And in particular, I wanted to point out, I co-chair the Kansas Sexual Assault Response Advisory Committee with the KBI and multidisciplinary group. A lot of professions are represented in it: healthcare, prosecutors, law enforcement, advocates. And we made many of these changes we recommended to the Attorney General's office for consideration because we think it has the tremendous opportunity to make a big difference in the lives of crime victims. In particular, I wanted to speak to the change around allowing eligibility for survivors who obtain the forensic exam but may not meet the reporting requirement to law enforcement. And I just want to say what we've learned over the years is that if we offer the opportunity to meet a crime victim's needs first, they often increase their cooperation with our system. And the way currently has been set up is that we expect them to cooperate with our system first, and then we'll meet their needs. And that has resulted in, a real decline in victims cooperating with the system. And so by helping them get their needs met, their medical needs met, their mental health needs met, we think that we increase the opportunity of their cooperation. So ultimately, I would just say we're in support of the changes. They may seem like small technical changes, but they really have the potential to make a tremendous impact in the lives of victims of crime. And so that's why we're in support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Committee, now if you have questions for any of the proponents, now's your opportunity. Okay. I guess we don't have any questions. You all did a great job explaining the bill to us. Thank you. Oh, someone online I'm so sorry. Could not see you. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Mr. Samaniego, you said when discussing the statute of limitations, there was obvious purpose for that. Not obvious to me. What is the purpose of statute of limitations in these cases?
Well, in different areas, it serves a policy purpose, but for the crime victims, obviously preserving funds is one of them, but also preserving evidence. But in the case of the Crime Victims Compensation Board, we look at factors that are readily available, such as police reports and, other evidence of harm or injury to the victim, including their testimony.
I don't understand why we shut the door.
At all?
Yes.
Yeah. And again, that's a policy decision for this legislature to make. We understand if you want to give us some
I understand how
limitations on what we can do, but
person might not have as a compelling of a case the longer they wait, but I just, I don't know why we slammed the door just because of the passage of time. It's not, to me, it's not the same as why we apply statutes of limitations in other circumstances. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I will add, if I may, Representative, the other sections give us.
Microphone on.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Other sections like the reporting to law enforcement or failure to report within 72 hours give us good cause exceptions. And so we would be open to that type of good cause finding, or as proposed in this legislation, a higher threshold to just let us consider those other claims because they are in need of assistance. And it's really hard as a board to hear that, to say sorry, 2 years. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, any other questions? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick follow-up on that. Is that provision allowing the board discretion to approve a claim beyond the statute of limitations, is that retroactive to cases that have perhaps been filed but denied because of the statute of limitations?
So the board has discretion to reopen any claim, but we'd have to make those findings.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, thank you so much. Committee, we also have written testimony from Kathy Ray from the Crisis Center, Inc. And I don't think we have any neutral or opponent testimony. Anybody? Okay, since not, I will close the hearing on House Bill 2781. And we're going to go ahead and get a review from Natalie about House Bill 2782. I'll open the hearing on that. And then when she finishes, we'll just have a little discussion on what some of the time limits and everything are going to be. So,
Madam Chair, a brief point of order.
yes.
In the agenda, the last opponent listed is Heath Samuels, who listed as Greenwood County Sheriff. He's son of Matt and Tammy. None of us can seemingly, or at least the people over here, cannot find his testimony anywhere, either online or otherwise. Could we have the assistance of someone, because I want to make sure we hear his testimony?
Do you have all the others? You found everyone else?
I haven't checked for everyone else,
Okay.
no, but I was looking particularly because Matt Samuels is the son, Heath Samuels is the son of Matt Samuels, the Greenwood County Sheriff, who was murdered by somebody who's in the penitentiary.
Okay. I'll see what we can do about that.
Perhaps research could look, or somebody, because it's important.
You do. Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe we could, Jordan would be able to make copies or scan it and send it or whatever you, okay. Yep. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Okay. Again, everybody, we're opening the hearing on House Bill 2782 and we'll hear from Natalie Scott, our revisor. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. House Bill 2782 authorizes the Secretary of Corrections to use hypoxia for the purpose of carrying out a sentence of death, and it requires the district court to issue a warrant to the Secretary of Corrections to carry out a sentence of death. Section 1 amends KSA 216619. That's the statute that requires automatic review of sentences of death by the Supreme Court. A new subsection E is added to provide that when all appeals and post-conviction proceedings are resolved, the Supreme Court shall notify the district court before which the conviction was rendered that such proceedings have been resolved and send a copy of the court's final order to that district court. Such order shall clearly state whether or not the sentence of death was affirmed. Section 2 amends KSA 224001, the statute related to executing a death sentence. Current law there requires a sentence of death to be executed by injection of a substance or substances in a quantity sufficient to cause death in a swift and humane manner. This bill would allow a sentence of death to be executed by hypoxia administered in such a way to cause death in a swift and humane manner. Current law in subsection C requires the Secretary of Corrections to select the type of substance to be administered in carrying out a sentence of death. The Secretary of Health and Environment is required to certify to the Secretary of Corrections that the substance or substances will result in death in a swift and humane manner. And the Secretary of Corrections may change the substance used and certify a new substance in accordance with those provisions. Subsection C is amended to require the Secretary of Corrections not later than December 31st, 2024, to select a type of substance to be administered in carrying out a death by injection and a method of carrying out a sentence of death by hypoxia. The provisions related to certification by the Secretary of Health and Environment are removed. The bill maintains the current law ability for the Secretary to change the substance or methods to be used. However, the method of carrying out a sentence of death by hypoxia is required to be adopted by the Secretary of Corrections in rules and regulations. Finally, in that section, subsection E is added to provide a definition of swift and humane manner, which would mean a manner consistent with the requirements of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Section 3 amends KSA 224013. That's the statute that puts the duty to execute a death sentence on the Secretary of Corrections. That section is amended to provide that when executing a sentence of death, the Secretary shall determine whether to use injection or hypoxia. Subsection B is amended to provide that during the pendency of an appeal or post-conviction proceedings, the execution of a death sentence shall be stayed. Current law in that section provides that upon receipt of an order of the district court, the Supreme Court shall issue to the Secretary of Corrections a warrant to proceed to carry out the sentence of execution during the week designated by the Supreme Court. This is amended to provide that when the district court receives an order from the Supreme Court, pursuant to that new requirement that we talked about that's being added to KSA 216619, affirming that sentence of death, then the district court shall issue the warrant that's described above and must include a week designated by the district court in which that sentence shall be executed. And that warrant has to be sent to the Secretary within 30 days. And I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Committee, do you have any questions for Natalie? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natalie, to clarify, the hearing today in this bill deals with the method of death, not whether or not we'll have a death sentence, correct? To clarify that.
Madam Chair, Representative Smith, I don't determine what can be discussed at a hearing. That's up to the chair. But the bill does not discuss whether or not the state of Kansas has a death penalty. It just talks about the method of executing the death penalty.
Thank you, Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 3, perhaps 4 quick questions. First, does the bill define hypoxia?
It does not.
Does the bill define swift
It does define swift and humane manner. That is on page 2, starting at line 38.
And my question was inartful. It says it means a manner consistent with the requirements of the Eighth Amendment, but does it define swift in terms of minutes, seconds, hours, days?
That's the only definition that appears. So there's no other definition of the word that contains swift.
That. And finally, Madam Reviser, this bill appears to deal with the penalty for capital murder. Would that be correct?
Madam Chair, the penalty for murder is, or for capital murder, excuse me, is a sentence of death. This adds a method right now that can only be carried out through an injection. And so this adds a method by which that can be carried out.
Thank you.
Committee, do you have any other questions? Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions that perhaps would be better for legislative research, but how many states currently use hypoxia as a method of execution?
I'm guessing that research can help you out with that one. Yeah.
And second question is, how many times has it been used?
Also, perhaps research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Committee, do you have any other questions? Okay, thank you, Natalie. It's been brought to my attention that possibly there's some other testimony that you don't have on the website. Do people have the Attorney General's testimony? He's going to go first. Did you find that on the website?
I believe I have copies of 2 pieces of testimony that purport to be from the Attorney General, but I'm not certain of that. But I think that's the case.
Okay, so one from the Attorney General, one from the Deputy Attorney General. Would that be true?
That's what I believe I have in my packet, but I've not made a thorough, I literally received this testimony moments ago.
Sorry, just 1 second. Everyone, we need to make sure that everyone's able to access what they need. Just a second. Okay, we're going to continue. All right, I'd like to reiterate the fact that today we're talking about House Bill 2782, and it is the method of execution. If we get off on a different topic, then I will have to ask you to stop and get back on the topic. This is what we're going to do. Because at the time, everyone is going to have 2.5 minutes for your testimony. There's 21 people who are testifying. I want to make sure we get to everybody. That pretty much takes up our whole time until 5 o'clock, but then we'll stay for questions because this is an awesome committee. So they'll, I'm sure, be willing to do that. So we're gonna start with 2.5 minutes. The vice chair will time you. You're gonna hold up a piece of paper when there's 30 seconds left. So then you know you're kind of getting to the end. Okay. I do have a gavel today. I do not want to use it. So let's all adhere to the gavel. Okay. So we're going to start with proponent testimony from Chris Kobach, the Kansas Attorney General. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. Our director of KBI generously offered to give me a minute of his testimony, if we may do that. I just want to make sure I cover everything for you guys, and I have a feeling you'll have questions. So let me dive right into it. In Kansas today, our statutes indicate, and our prosecutors aver, and our public believes that we have the death penalty. However, we're currently unable to implement that penalty for two reasons. Number one, the lethal injection drugs are becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to acquire. And number two, there's a gap in our statutes that doesn't stipulate or specify how a final execution order should be issued. So consequently, in my opinion, we're lying to the people of Kansas when we tell them that we are going to carry out an execution if we can't actually carry out an execution, which is why we need to enact House Bill 2782. It will enable the state of Kansas to be honest with the public and carry out executions as the people of Kansas expect. You've already heard what current law says. This bill simply adds hypoxia to making it two possible methods, and it also stipulates how the Supreme Court would issue a final order of execution to the district court, and then the district court would communicate with the Secretary of Corrections. At one point on the method and the problems with that, a number of pharmaceutical manufacturers, including Pfizer in 2016, have said they are no longer willing to provide these drugs for the purpose of execution. And then shortly after that, some of the nations in the European Union said they are not going to allow such chemicals to be sent to the United States for the purpose of execution. So, for example, in South Carolina, 2 executions were halted because they could not obtain the drugs before the execution date. Last execution in Kansas was 1965. The death penalty was reinstituted in 1994 after the Supreme Court in the 1972 case, which terminated death penalties, in the 1976 case, where the Supreme Court said they can continue under certain conditions. That opened the door and the state started reinstituting the death penalty after 1976. Since 1994, there have been 15 death penalties sentences laid out or imposed by the juries imposing those sentences. Of those, 4 have had their sentences reduced to life in prison, not because they were found to be innocent, but because there were various legal reasons that would allow the reduction of their sentence. 2 others escaped justice because they died of natural causes in prison, and 9 remain on death row now. There is, of course, a denial of justice when justice is denied, but I think there is a particular injury that is done to the victims' families when they have to wait so long. Many of these cases are well over 20 years old. I want to quickly mention the Kleypas case. Gary Kleypas committed murder in 1996 when he beat, raped, and killed a young woman named Carrie Williams, a Pittsburgh University student. One of the members of the Williams family is here. Even though he confessed to the murder 3 days after it occurred, it was 2 years before he was sentenced to death. 26 years later, he remains in prison. Her father passed away. Carrie's father passed away before he could see justice for his daughter. After suffering for nearly 3 decades, more members of the Williams family should not pass away before seeing justice for their daughter. And the same is happening in other families of these victims. So why this bill now? As these cases proceed past the appeals phase into the execution phase, we need to be ready to carry out the execution, and we're not right now. It's possible that one of the cases could be ready for execution as quickly as 9 months from now, depending on how fast the Court of Appeals acts. I'm not saying it will be 9 months from now. It could be later than that. It's entirely up to the Court of Appeals how fast they move. But the point is, we would need to be ready 9 months from now, if that is in fact when the time comes. It should also be pointed out that we don't become ready just by passing this bill. The bill then requires the Secretary of Corrections to act for the rest of the year, 6 months or however many months till the end of the year, December 31st. So there's an additional delay beyond that. I want to quickly answer one of the questions that was asked about other states. Currently, 3 states have moved to hypoxia. Those are Alabama, Oklahoma, and Mississippi. This legislative session, Kansas, Ohio, and Nebraska, there may be others, are contemplating the move to hypoxia. I'll just conclude with this. Hypoxia is without question the preferred method that states are moving to now. And indeed, it should also be noted that some of the societies and organizations that advocate suicide and assisted suicide, they advocate hypoxia as the most painless method of suicide. So it is the chosen method, and I'll end with this. In the Alabama case, I'm sure there'll be questions about that. There was a recent Alabama use of hypoxia. The individual, Mr. Smith, a year and a half ago, was arguing to the district court that lethal injection was cruel and inhumane, and the only humane way he could be executed was by hypoxia. Alabama changed its law to allow hypoxia. He then changed his argument, said hypoxia is cruel and inhumane, and the only humane way to be executed was by firing squad. At that point, the judge disagreed with his petition. The point is that opponents of the death penalty will always argue that everything is inhumane. This is the preferred method today, which other states are moving to, and we simply want to be ready so that when the time comes, these families that have been waiting 25, 28 years don't have to wait another 2 years for Kansas to do what we can do right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll call Vic Braden from the Deputy Attorney General's office.
Representative Humphreys, committee, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate Representative Humphreys going through and making sure that we limit our discussion to the particular issue of the process. I did provide written statement, and for time, I would just ask you to consider the statement that I provided. Thank you.
Oh, that was it. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Please stay for questions in case we have questions. Greg Smith, Johnson County Sheriff and Family, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's actually two testimonies I have. One is for the Johnson County Sheriff's Office. One is as the father of a murder victim who was killed by someone that is subject to capital murder. I'll stick to my Johnson County Sheriff's Office testimony, but if I stray off to personal, I'll remove my credentials so that you know that I'm not speaking for the Sheriff's Office. Our testimony lists 25 people that were murdered in the state of Kansas whose murderers are on death row. We don't really have a death row in Kansas, but those 9 people are on death row. They're grouped in categories by who killed them. But you will not see the name of the killers in my testimony because I think it's more important that we talk about the victims rather than the killers. For all of the reasons that General Kobach talked about, Johnson County Sheriff's Office supports this bill. But the most important reason for this is that the victims' families are waiting. And some of these cases are coming down to the end. They've almost exhausted all of their appeals, and it'll be time to carry out the sentence. And we need to make sure that that can happen. And this bill allows that to happen. Now, as the father of a murder victim, my daughter, Kelsey Smith, was kidnapped in 2007. She was taken over to the state of Missouri. She was raped. She was sodomized. She was strangled to death, and she was left out in the woods. And her killer was subject to capital murder as punishment. The only reason Kelsey's name is not on that list of victims is because he decided to plead guilty after my family went and talked to the federal prosecutor. And he knew that the federal government would do a death penalty. They would execute someone for this type of murder. And he pled guilty on the condition that Kansas remove the death penalty from his sentence. So he's in jail or in prison for the rest of his life without any possibility of parole. It's important that there's some kind of finality for these victims. But the victims are the ones who were subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. They have no recourse. They can't go to court and file some petition about what happened to them. They are dead. This bill makes sure that families can get some finality. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Mark Bennett from the 18th Judicial District, which is Sedgwick County. Welcome to committee.
In December of 2000, I was working in the district attorney's office when we had 2 quadruple murders within a span of about a week. I tried one of them, and he was convicted of 4 counts of murder and given 120 years to life. The other case was the Carr brothers, who was tried a year later, and they were given the death sentence. I remember at the time wondering if I had done a disservice to those families of Rashonda Wheaton, Quincy Williams, Jermaine Levy, and Dessa Ford, the 4 kids who were killed in my case. I have come to change to a difference of opinion. They lucked out. Those families did, because they did not get a death sentence. because that case is done, has been done for decades. The same week, another set of quadruple murders took place in Wichita, the Carr brothers cases. And those families have come to court. They have followed us all the way to Washington, D.C., where we argued in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. Just this past December, I was on the phone with them again, 23 years after the fact, talking to them about the new round of appeals that will take place. To be very clear, I'm here simply on behalf of those families. I think the most important portion of this bill is found at Section 2C1A, which adds the timeline of December 31st of 2024 by requiring a path forward and a timeline on that. It will, I'm not going to get into whether or not we should or shouldn't have the death penalty, but it puts a fine point on the issue. If we have it, and we do, how will it be imposed? That argument may come down the road, but we need to put a fine point on this. That we need for the secretary to say this is how it would be imposed, because there's a whole host of folks here who are going to be then ready at the ready to argue on behalf of their respective clients why that is or isn't the right way to go. But right now, it's simply ephemeral. It's an abstraction. And I'm sat across the table from, and I added it up on the way up here this morning, 23 separate families I've sat across the table from trying to explain what a death sentence would mean. And what I finally tell people now is what a death sentence means is that you will, if you're the family members of the victims, you will buy yourself 30 years worth of this process. I won't be here to see it through. You probably won't be here to see it through. I tell them, but your grandkids will. This doesn't speed it up, but it adds a point of finality. And I think we owe them that. Last thing I'll say is my last page of my testimony. In my haste last night, apparently I forgot a word. It is my unequivocal position that we owe them a clear answer to whether there is any point in asking them to continue. That's what it should have read. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Tony Mativi, Director of the KBI. And we are gonna, you did give a little bit of your time away. So
to be clear, I offered him my entire time and he only took a minute. So look, because time is short, I'm not going to speak to you from my notes. I'm going to speak to you from my heart. I'm here to speak on behalf of law enforcement. You have heard and will hear from victims, and those voices are far more compelling and they're far more important than mine. But our agents, our brethren in law enforcement, our scientists respond to these scenes of unspeakable violence and unimaginable tragedy. And it has an impact on them. Not the same impact that it has on the families, but it has an impact that can be life-altering. This bill is not about whether we have the death penalty or how quickly it gets carried out. This bill is only about being ready when the time comes. I worked on the Kleypas case 26 years ago. I don't want to overstate my involvement. I was a young prosecutor. I carried the briefcase for John Bork, the real prosecutor in the case. It's all I did. But that was 26 years ago. And that man still sits on death row. When the time comes, finally, we have an obligation to be ready. We have an obligation to the victims' families. We have an obligation to the prosecutors who put all that work into the case. We have an obligation to law enforcement in Kansas when the time comes to be ready. Thank you, Madam Chair.
thank you. We appreciate that. Okay, committee. Now we have Jennifer Aldridge. I think our agenda says Julie, but is it Jennifer? Jennifer. Okay, thank you for that correction. Welcome to committee.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Jennifer Aldridge, and my little sister is Jody Sanderholm. And I'd like to read you a little bit of my testimony today. 6,255 days, just a month and a half more than 17 years. Think about what you have accomplished in 17 years. In that time, I've gone from being pregnant with my first child to that baby now being a junior in high school. I went from being a 23-year-old young adult right out of college to being a 40-year-old mother to 5 children. I can only imagine the incredible things my sister would have accomplished over the last nearly 2 decades, completing pharmacy school, marrying, having children of her own. However, in 17 years, there has been nothing done to my sister's killer, who was convicted of aggravated kidnapping, rape, aggravated criminal sodomy, and capital murder. January 5th, 2007 is the day that will forever be burned into my memory. That's the day I learned my little sister, Jody Leanne Sanderholm, had gone missing. Over the next 4 days, I learned that not only did she go missing, but then I gave birth to my first child, a daughter, and then ultimately learning that my sister's body had been found. So many true crime documentaries and podcasts start out by saying the victim lit up the room. That was especially true for my sister. She was the epitome of what every mother dreams of having as a daughter: smart, responsible, kind, beautiful, caring. The world was robbed of an incredible life that January day 17 years ago, when Justin Thurber decided to kidnap her, torture her, beat and sexually assault her for 5 hours before ultimately murdering her by strangulation and blunt force trauma. Jody had over 20 contusions on her head and was violated. So she was strangled multiple times. Seeing photos of my sister's lifeless, naked, bruised, and beaten, violated body is something that I still see at night when I close my eyes 17 years later. Imagine that being your sister, your daughter, your granddaughter. Before my sister was killed, I don't think I really had an opinion on the death penalty, but hearing and seeing the evidence at trial, a jury convicted Thurber and recommended the death penalty. A judge then sentenced Thurber to death in March of 2009. Since then, he's remained on death row. He's had one appeal. He's in the middle of his appeal. No decision has been made on that. He was guaranteed the right to a speedy trial, but we are not guaranteed a right to a speedy penalty. I just want to end by saying that we've had the death penalty for over 30 years reinstated and not executed a single member of death row. A vote for this bill is a vote for Jody Sanderholm, Matt Samuels, Brad Hika, Jason Befford, Heather Mueller, HG, Aaron, Andy, Ann, 18-month-old Lana, and her mother Kaylee, Andrew, Stephen, Carrie, William, Reed, Terry, Karen, Emily, and Lauren, Dorothy, Mickey, Darren, Suzette, Isabella, Lisa, Sheila, and Beverly. You should know those names. Each of those are individuals murdered by a Kansas death row inmate, and we, their families and loved ones, are asking for your help.
Thank you. Lynn Denton, are you here? Thank you for coming to committee. Welcome. If you just make sure you introduce yourself when you get up to the mic.
Hi, my name's Lynn Denton. I am Karen Caitler's sister, Emily and Lauren's aunt, and Dorothy White's granddaughter. Please don't tell me to stop once I start. November 28th, 2009. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving. That was the night Greg Gaylor shot and killed my sister, Karen. my two nieces, Emily and Lauren, and shot and mortally wounded my grandma, Dorothy, who died of her injuries on December 1st. It happened at my grandma's house in Burlingame. And that was the day my life changed forever. I'd like to tell you a little bit about these women, starting with Grandma, Dorothy White. She loved her family and was proud of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was generous, kind, smart, and loved to read. I love to remember the stories she shared about growing up in Burlingame and playing the sousaphone in high school band. There are so many great memories of time spent at her house. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, she would take a Swiss Mocha International coffee break. Even now, when I really miss her, I like to take a few minutes at 3 o'clock and have coffee with Grandma. She was the glue that held our family together, and it was at her house when our families would gather for holidays and celebrations. Craig took that away from us. Karen was my big sister. She was smart, talented, creative, and so much fun. She loved her family and offered encouragement and support in all their various activities. Karen was my resource to call when I couldn't figure out what to make for dinner. She'd ask what I had in the cupboard and then come up with something delicious. We would spend lots of time on the phone since we lived so far apart. My husband Tim would ask what on earth we talked about for so long, and my response was almost always nothing. When we did get together in person, it was always fun and full of adventure, even if it was a trip to the grocery store. She was my sister, my best friend, and I miss her.
So, Lynn, do you think, help us kind of, tell us how this bill is going to help?
Okay.
Thank you.
I got Emily. She's awesome. Lauren was 16 and my goddaughter. And this started on the 28th of November, 2009. Since there's been a trial and conviction and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court in the motion, the 1507 motion. Now it's 2024. Craig's sentence has been affirmed. It has yet to be carried out. There's no finality. He killed 4 people. There's no question that he did it, and he needs to suffer the consequences of his action. Craig was able to pay for his own defense by using his own funds. But by the end of the trial, he ran out of money. So now he's considered indigent, and the state of Kansas taxpayers are paying for his appeals. I resent that. Living through the trial was awful. Listening to expert testimony, autopsy reports, and the life alert recording of that night. Now there's a non-evidentiary hearing scheduled to take place in the next few months to argue 14 points of this motion. It's been scheduled once. It's been continued twice. This extended appeal process is emotional, stressful, and painful. Every time there's a new appeal, it tears open old wounds, making it feel fresh and raw. It's also been brought to my attention that Craig has the right to be there for this hearing and will most likely be there. So he gets to take a field trip from death row on taxpayer money. I resent that. Many family members who were directly affected by Craig's selfish actions that awful night have passed away since this nightmare began. I resent that they're not able to see his sentence carried out. All these years later, there's no end in sight for finality, for justice, for Grandma, Karen, Emily, and Lauren. Please thoughtfully and gravely consider this House Bill 2782 on behalf of all the victims and their families. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I'm so sorry I talked so long.
Thank you. Dylan Smith, are you? Written testimony? That's written. Okay, thank you. Dylan is written. What about Missy Smith? Written or in? Yep. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. My name is Missy Smith. I am here to support 2782. I am the mother of Kelsey. My husband Greg spoke earlier. I am also your constituent, Representative Vaughn, and you don't answer any of my emails. So I'm a little disturbed by that. But regardless, this bill is not about should there be a death penalty. There is one. This is giving the Department of Corrections the tools they need to carry out the sentence that was given to them. That's it. And I implore you, please do that. The people that are on death row are not nice people. You have my written testimony that talks about it. Our daughter was kidnapped in broad daylight, taken by gunpoint across state lines, raped repeatedly. She was choked out with her own belt, brought back and then raped again and choked out again until he finally murdered her. It was so atrocious. Her neck was cut from the belt. These are not nice people that can be rehabilitated. Please give the Department of Corrections the tools they need to carry out the sentence that has been given to them. Thank you. And I will answer any questions should you have any.
Thank you, Missy. Okay, committee, that is the proponent testimony. Dylan Smith is written only, and also Ed Klump, whom you know, Julie Maddox, on behalf of Carrie Williams, and Heath Samuels, that we got that written testimony actually as a proponent instead of an opponent. So you might look at that written proponent testimony. So now we'll go to questions for the proponents. Committee, what questions do we have for the proponents? Representative Mon.
This question is directed to Attorney General Kobach. So, just to start off, I'm generally in favor of this bill, but obviously members of the committee may have seen reports, news reports from Alabama about the death sentence that was imposed there that became apparently didn't go quite the way it was expected, and I know you prepared for this because it would have been something that you would have known about. So I'm just asking if you can address any concerns that people may have about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you for the question. I just spoke this morning with the Alabama Attorney General and spoke with him last week as well. He had his staff there and he gave the order for the execution to begin. They said there was no evident inhumanity or problem with it. He thought it was carried out humanely and swiftly and effectively. There has been some press reporting, and the press reporting is almost all quoted a gentleman by the name of Lee Hedgepath, who was there. But the press has represented or suggested that Mr. Hedgepath was a member of the media. He was not a media observer. He was a guest of the inmate and an anti-death penalty activist. According to the Attorney General's office, the movement that did occur was when the inmate held his breath and kept holding his breath to try to not inhale the nitrogen. I think most people, when they try to hold their breath for a long time, will move. The other point I would mention is movement does not indicate pain. And the Supreme Court has said that the Eighth Amendment does not require a painless execution. There is no constitutional right to be free from any discomfort. And finally, I would add, even if there were a minor amount of discomfort, which it appears there was not, let's remember the intense pain and agony that the victims felt. This is the best form, the most humane, painless form of execution that we know right now. The suicide societies are all recommending it to their clients. right now. And I urge you, Representative Carmichael, you asked about the second piece of testimony. You might have been looking at the Oklahoma study. I had 2 documents. So there's my testimony, and then there's a study commissioned by the state of Oklahoma that goes into great detail about how this method works and why it is humane and why it is the most painless or the least painful method we know of right now.
Point of order, Madam Chair. My reference was the written testimony of Victor J. Braden, your Deputy Attorney General, that is in my packet along with your.
You just mentioned 2 pieces of paper.
Whatever
Okay.
document you were.
I think it had your logo at the top. And so when you turn the page, we could see who it was actually.
Well, then I just would urge you all to look at my testimony then, and you should see attached to it about maybe a 13-page document, which is from the state of Oklahoma, where they commissioned a study on it.
Thank you. Committee, do you have any other questions? Representative Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Attorney General, I know the U.S. Supreme Court has never found a method of execution unconstitutional, and there are very few states that use electrocution or firing squad or those means. I don't need the whole history, but just briefly, and I understand why the drugs aren't available anymore, so how did we get to this point where we're looking at a new method?
Well, I believe that it's 20-some states, I think it might be 27 or 28, that have the death penalty right now. And almost all of them, with a couple of exceptions, moved in the direction of lethal injection. You heard the testimony about how the drugs have become unavailable now. And during this, there's a lot of litigation. And in litigation where an individual makes an Eighth Amendment claim that a particular method is cruel and unusual, they usually, indeed almost always, will have to tell the court what they think would be a humane method. And throughout the last 10 to 15 years, if you read those cases, they will almost always, when they're challenging lethal injection, they will say hypoxia is a more humane way of executing the individual. And that has been what we have seen in the courts for many, many years. And so now states are moving to hypoxia, not because the defendants were demanding it, but because out of necessity. The bottom line is we have some cases reaching the end of the tunnel now, and we have to be ready. And if we wait and don't pass this bill, and then we're standing there without the ability to carry out the execution, we are causing these families to wait another 2 years until we finally are ready to go. And so this is about being ready, not about whether we have the death penalty.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Attorney General, can we agree that this bill does not either require nor prohibit, for that matter, well, let me rephrase that. This bill does not require that the penalty of death be carried out by nitrogen hypoxia. It rather leaves that door open to other forms of hypoxia, depending upon the determination of Secretary of Corrections as further specified in the law.
That is correct. And if I might just add, hypoxia is the deprivation of oxygen, but it is understood to be replacing oxygen with another inert gas. Nitrogen hypoxia is the most frequent way that it is used. But if you, again, making reference to those suicide organizations, they often promote helium hypoxia. So it is not the only way, but that's why it's left open to the Secretary of Corrections to adopt the most humane and best method of hypoxia.
Madam Chair, a second question following up on the Attorney General's remark. This bill does not require that the hypoxia occur as a result of replacement by a different gas. This bill just says hypoxia, which generally is thought of as deprivation of oxygen. It could literally be suffocation if the humaneness standards were met. Can you point to me where it is that this bill says that oxygen has to be replaced by a different gas?
Hypoxia is not strangulation, sir. And no,
I didn't say that it was, sir.
You're suggesting that the complete stopping of breathing is what it is.
I did not suggest that. I suggested that this bill does not require replacement of oxygen by any gas. It's suffocation, isn't it, sir?
It is not suffocation. Suffocation and hypoxia are two completely different things, and the courts, I am certain, and the scientific community do not regard them as the same.
Your bill does not define it in the manner in which you believe it does. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Perhaps you could offer an amendment.
I have no intention other to try to save this constitutionally flawed and cruel bill. No, ma'am. No, sir.
Are there any other questions, committee? Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony, Attorney General. The bill itself doesn't change the timeline of appeal or the methods of appeal or the number of appeals or anything else procedurally, correct?
That is correct. So what it does is the reason these families have had to wait so long is because of the appeal process, but we're now getting to the point where some of those appeals are coming close to a final conclusion. If we don't pass this bill, there will be another long period until we either eventually pass this bill or somehow miraculously the drugs become available. And so I don't think we should force these families to wait additionally when by passing the bill, the state can be ready.
Thank you. Your previous testimony included that there's only 3 states right now that have death by hypoxia as a means of execution, and I believe that there's only one known execution by hypoxia.
That is correct.
So that doesn't seem to me to be a groundswell of states. So I'm just trying to figure out, is there any testimony that you provided or that you're aware of from any of the other proponents that shows the effectiveness of this method of execution or shows how this is the most humane version of execution?
In my written testimony, you'll see the Oklahoma study attached to it. Was commissioned by the state of Oklahoma, and it goes into great detail about each of those questions. You know, how long does it take? What does the individual feel? Things like that.
Okay, thank you. I'll review it. I don't think it was on
the website. We'll make sure that everybody gets it.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Landwehr and then Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's not so much a question, and probably with your opening comments that you'd like to cut me off, but having grown up in a family of law enforcement, known murder victims' families, and what they go through, and as you heard from Tony Mativi, that what the officers go through, that is cruel and unusual punishment. And these families live this every time they have to face this. That is cruel. It is them reliving the death of their loved one every single time. That is cruel. In my personal opinion, there is nothing cruel enough that we can do to one of these individuals that have taken a life. Thank you.
Representative Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here, General Kobach. In terms of the different applications of the death penalties over the year, I presume that you've studied that. So hanging on the courthouse lawn, was that ruled unconstitutional at some point, which led to the firing squad, which led to the lethal injection, which has led to hypoxia, or are those alternatives still constitutionally available?
Most of them were not terminated because of a Supreme Court ruling. Most of them were ceased because public sensibilities changed and states moved to define the method of execution. I think in Alabama, if I remember reading that case most recently, I think the electric chair is still one of the options, but it's never chosen because in today's society, people don't think of that as a humane or a preferred form of execution. Utah still does have death penalty by firing squad, but I think the changes over the years have been driven by sensibilities of the public that this should be done in the most humane manner possible. And the two most humane manners are lethal injection and hypoxia. Kansas would have those on the books. It would be up to the Secretary of Corrections to choose which can be carried out and which is the best.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, are there any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, proponents. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for your testimony. We talked about the written proponents. We will now hear from the opponents. First, I will call Chuck Weber with the Kansas Catholic Conference. And just a reminder, everyone, we're trying for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief. My name is Chuck Weber. I represent the Catholic Bishops of Kansas. We have a consistent position on the inherent dignity and value of every life, every stage of development, every stage of life, including the lives of the victims that you heard about earlier before me, includes issues like assisted suicide, abortion, and the issue that we're talking about here today, the execution of men and women in our penal system. We submit that the use of hypoxia, like all intentional methods of ending life, are attacks against the dignity of the human person. Number two, perhaps even more to the point, really what we're talking about today, the manner of this death is very much in question. It does not appear to be swift nor humane based on the very small sample we have right now regarding the Alabama case. I have a full testimony. I'm not going to read that, but I do want to represent the words of my boss, Archbishop Joseph Naumann, who could not be here today. He was in his mother's womb when his father was murdered in the back of a grocery store in 1948, I believe. Archbishop says, the suffering and circumstances of each family who's lost a loved one by violent crime are unique, and I do not presume to speak for all victims of murder. Yet I did witness how my mother struggled to provide for our family without the benefit of my father and the pain she suffered as a result of losing the love of her life. I also know what it's like for children to grow up without a father. In opposing this measure, it is not my intention to minimize the pain and the loss of individuals and families who have suffered the death of a loved one as a result of a violent crime. We can do better. Thank you. I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
We'll hear all the opponent testimony and then do questions. Thank you. Donna, I'm going to have to let you introduce yourself when you get up here. Thank you. Welcome. Schneeweiss. Okay, thank you. Welcome.
Chairperson Humphreys and members of the committee, I am Donna Schneeweiss. I am the chair of the Kansas Coalition Against the Death Penalty. In our coalition, we have a number of murder victim family members, and we stand in opposition to this bill. One of them really wanted to be with you today. She was unable to because of work. Her name is Celeste Dixon. The testimony is there. She was horrified at what happened in Alabama. Please read her testimony. It is very important. The second thing I want to highlight is that, as was noted in the bill, there's not the word nitrogen for hypoxia. It only talks about methods to get there. We have seen a couple instances in recent years, in the last, since 76, where lethal gas executions done with cyanide were botched. They were very badly botched. In the case in Mississippi, they pulled the witnesses out of the room after 8 minutes of lethal gas because they were repulsed by the way the inmate was gasping. I believe Dr. Joel Zivot has some testimony for you about lethal injection and what they're finding on autopsy in terms of what it does to the body. I just want to make a very practical point. That is, when some of these states do lethal injections, they use a paralytic. When a paralytic is given, if a person's in pulmonary edema and their body is trying to compensate by increasing their respiratory drive, they can't do it because the chemical blocks their respiratory muscles. So their lungs are filling with fluid, and that is how they are dying. With this bill, with the lack of provisions for safeguards in this process of securing lethal injection drugs, figuring out what they should be, the vagueness of what the hypoxia is going to be, we are setting in place more secrecy, less safeguards. We are setting Kansas up for a botched execution. Do you want to let the Kansas government take a life in that context? And I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Cessna, Kansas State Board of Indigenous Defense Services. Hi, Heather. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Humphreys and members of the committee for having us today. My name is Heather Cessna, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas State Board of Indigenous Defense Services. And I'm here today in opposition because our board voted last Friday to oppose this bill. And while there are a variety of people who are going to testify about the legal ramifications and the moral and ethical questions that are raised by these amendments, I'm here to talk about the impact that we believe this will have on our specific agency, on the attorney shortages that we currently have on capital cases, and the cost of what this will be to our agency. Specifically, we do not have enough capital attorneys as it is in the state of Kansas, either as public defenders or as private counsel, to handle the large number of capital cases that we currently have, let alone those that are being charged. And our concerns with this particular bill is that the additional time restraints, confusion, unpredictability, and risk of injustice in particular in this case will help make a substantial impact on the amount of turnover that we have in our public defenders' offices, and particularly in our capital public defenders' offices. The other concerns that we have here are fiscal, and that is that the amendments as they are proposed are of such a nature that they raise a variety of potential legal issues that we believe will increase substantially the amount of litigation that our agency is going to be required to fund on behalf of our clients in order to provide the professionally and ethically and constitutionally required effective assistance of counsel. So it is our belief that these proposed changes should be opposed for that reason. And I'm happy to answer additional questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, if we can have Floyd Bledsoe come on up. Welcome to committee.
Thank you for having me here. As Madam Chair said, my name is Floyd Bledsoe. I stand in opposition to the way the bill is written. As I look around this room, I see a lot of people that have heard me testify before you guys several times. With respect to the victims of various crimes, my heart goes out to them because they do live in a lot of turmoil. I will never minimize that. But as another side of justice, you can't minimize my side. I spent 16 years in prison for a crime I didn't do. Twice, my conviction was affirmed. For 4.5 years, I sat in prison with no appeals, no nothing. And I understand, with respect to Chris Kobach, or the Attorney General, excuse me, that it doesn't expedite or minimize appeals. But once the way I understand the bill, once that appeal has been affirmed, then the execution is to be carried out. that raises a lot of problems. Because once you execute one innocent person, how do you bring that person back? Just like there's nothing that ever can bring back the victims. There's several flaws in this. And I respectfully oppose it because of the simple fact that it puts people in control that probably should not be necessarily the ones to make the decision on what method of execution should be used. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bledsoe. I believe we have Dr. Joel Zivit on WebEx.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you. And I don't know if you've been watching. We're trying to keep it to about 2.5 minutes. So
Yeah, yes.
okay, thank you. Welcome to committee.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. So I'm an anesthesiologist and intensivist. I've been in practice for almost 30 years. In that time, I've probably cared for thousands of patients, and I've certainly been near death and suffering on many occasions and frankly on a weekly basis. I'm here to voice my objection to House Bill 2782. I'm not here to talk about the rightness or wrongness of capital punishment. Capital punishment is currently lawful in Kansas, and Kansas has an obligation to uphold the law by making sure that any method of execution that it selects not be in violation of the Eighth Amendment, which of course forbids any punishment to be cruel or unusual. I'm going to focus really on page 2 near the top and continue on page 3 of this bill. Specifically, the statement that says intravenous injection of substances in a quantity to cause death. And the second, hypoxia administered in a way to cause death in a swift and humane manner. Humane way, rather, sorry. And people have made this point that the thing about a bill like HB 2782 is it should read like an instruction manual, that anyone that read it should be able to do it. And clearly, the language in this bill is so vague, able to be used in that way. And further, 2 points. The first point is that lethal injection is basically flawed on its face. I know this because I have myself done research on this. I've reviewed autopsies of about 250 prisoners executed by lethal injection, and about 8 out of 10 times, instead of falling off to sleep and dying, they actually are drowning in their own blood. Now, people have made points about suicide, and let me just point out that when people choose to commit suicide, the way that they don't pick to die is by drowning. That's a very unpopular way to die. We know that drowning is terrifying, and so lethal injection is like death by drowning. The second point that I want to make is that hypoxia is a terrible way to die. I know this because I have cared for many, many people who have died of hypoxia, and certainly Alabama proved it in spite of its baseless claims, both before and after, that the execution went according to a textbook that had, of course, has never been written, and this method has never been done. So it's really, this bill does not help Kansas in any way do what it wants to do. Further, the Secretary of Corrections has far too much power and discretion in this manner. I understand that because of concerns about access to pharmaceuticals or changing circumstance, there wants to be some discretion here, but the discretion is going to lead to disaster. I promise you that. Secrecy also that's in place here makes these things much worse, and shrouding this in secrecy is the opposite action of a system that is designed to get things right. In medicine, we embrace transparency. And of course, corrections has the opposite view of this. They shroud what they do in secrecy, and there's no way to really know. You know, when you watch an execution, it's a highly curated event. You can only see certain sorts of things. So you have to give up your pen, your phone, watch, everything. You're watching through glass in the part that only the corrections allows you to see. So if you try to make some sense of that, it's very difficult. And that's why after these executions, witnesses say that was a terrible thing, and correction says it went beautifully.
And wouldn't mind, go ahead and give us your last point. Thank you. Yeah.
So, I think that this bill is a huge step backwards. Kansas will benefit nothing by this, and this bill should be roundly rejected. And thanks, and I'll stand for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Philip Bickler, also on WebEx. No, he's not here. We'll see if he comes along, but we don't have him at the moment. Dr. Michael Lipnick on WebEx. Nope. Do we have Dora? Sure. Yes. Dora, are you there?
I am. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. If you would please introduce yourself and then go ahead and start. Thank you.
I certainly will. I am Dr. Dora Schro, a corrections expert. In the course of my career, I've served as a warden of a city jail in St. Louis City, assistant commissioner and then commissioner of 2 city jail systems, St. Louis and New York City, and department director of 2 state correctional systems, Missouri and Arizona, both capital punishment jurisdictions. As DOC director, I presided over 35 executions. As one who has had considerable experience administering the death penalty, I come before you to express my concerns about House Bill 2782. As others have testified, it is well settled that the Constitution requires the government's method of execution to be swift and humane. My understanding is that even before the introduction of HB 2782, Kansas's statutory law required this as well. Kansas's bill proposes the state adopt a practice that Alabama employed unsuccessfully last month. Was I director in a state with a comparable provision and a foreseeable outcome? I would be hard pressed to participate or to ask others to do so. What those of us in corrections do, we must do correctly. And so what I'd like to do now is just briefly touch on several of those points. The nitric and gas method that Alabama DOC employed last month was not only cruel and unusual, but it also put correctional personnel who participated in his execution at unnecessary risk of exposure to both an excessively violent act and to the gas should there be a leak in the line or issues with Mr. Smith's mask fit. It also condones, albeit inadvertently, excess force as acceptable under some circumstances. Not only is this method of execution contrary to law, but it is also contrary to our commitment that we care for our correctional staff. Not only that, not all crime victims and survivors are proponents of capital punishment by any means or some means. They are also vulnerable to vicarious trauma. To enact this bill is to subject them as well. In the interest of time, just one additional point, and that is lastly that this bill transfers from DHE to DOC the responsibility to secure the necessary certifications and assurances of safety for hypoxia or lethal injection. It is my understanding that neither the DOC nor its contracted healthcare provider has the expertise to perform these duties. And for these and other reasons as included in my submitted testimony, I oppose this bill and urge this committee to do the same.
Thank you. Now we'll have Kelson Bonnet come up. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Kelson Bonnet, and I'm an attorney in the Kansas Public Defender System's Death Penalty Defense Unit. And our unit is responsible for the trial level representation for those individuals who are facing the possibility of the death penalty. And I want to use my brief time, I think, just to, very sorrowfully correct what I think is a misperception about how these cases begin at their inception and the effect this bill would or would not have. I am the person that brings the news to one of my capital clients that the government has filed a piece of paper announcing their intent to kill them. And even without this bill, that is one of the most sickening conversations that somebody can imagine. And even in the best of circumstances that we have, I'm not having that conversation with somebody doing this sober cost benefit analysis, because these are people who are severely mentally ill. They are cognitively impaired. They are drug addicts. They are alcoholics. They're the victims of severe trauma. And when this conversation takes place, it takes them.
Madam Chair, I think this is getting a little further afield from the actual bill and the method, and going more into whether the death penalty is actually viable.
So, Mr. Bonnet, if you would stay on the bill, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
The point there was that conversation is difficult, and the death penalty doesn't speed up or make the case initially more efficient. It adds layers of complexity. When I think about adding HB 2872 to that conversation now is with a human being talking about the lack of a check on what kind of lethal injection poison can be put in his veins. It's a conversation about suffocation and no real check on what that means. It's a conversation about, now we have taken what were two agencies and put all of that power into one with Department of Corrections. And the point there is that this compounds the human reaction and the problem and adds more layers of complexity, and it will not bring the case, despite popular belief or a sample size of one. It will not bring them to swift closure. Don't take my word for that. Mr. Bennett, who spoke before, said exactly the right thing, that the families who do not have that sentence of death, they are lucking out there, because this will add those layers of complexity. It will make these cases orders of magnitude more difficult. And it is just not grounded in the reality of how the death penalty actually works starting at the trial level. Please do not do what the Attorney General is asking. Thank you, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Now we have Caroline Zeschik and Brandon Barrett. Are you here? Are you coming up together? What's the plan here? Okay. And you're Brandon, I'm assuming. Okay. Thank you. Welcome to committee. If you'll introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Brandon Barrett. My wife, Caroline Zeschik, and I filed joint testimony, but I'll be speaking. However, both of us will be available for questions at the appropriate time. I'm coming to speak from what is an unfortunate perspective. I believe I'm one of the limited number of attorneys in the state of Kansas that currently practices here that has actually lost a client to execution. I assisted in the representation of a man named Michael Worthington back in 2014 when I practiced in Kansas City, Missouri. He was executed on August 6th at the age of 43. As I approach my 43rd birthday, I think back on the time that I spent, the work that I did, and how I failed. The execution of Mr. Worthington occurred by lethal injection. By media reports, there was nothing unusual. There was no outward signs of suffering. However, I don't do capital work anymore, as a large part of the result of having to deal with that scenario. Even with what was supposed to be a normal situation, as much as one can call it that, I still have guilt. There's still anger. There's still a question of what more maybe could have been done to help this man. That was under what is supposedly the best case scenario. Hypoxia is not. Media reporting seems to indicate a 22-minute death for the Alabama individual. That is torture. That is cruel. That is unusual. That does not comport with the values that Kansans hold dear. The secondary trauma that I suffered is suffered by every member of the criminal legal system. The police, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, experts, everybody. If you start to introduce a torturous method of execution, you will guarantee the loss of employees across all three of those factor sets. You will certainly guarantee the loss of defense attorneys without which you cannot proceed constitutionally in any manner whatsoever. I believe that's the purpose of any attorney, to show the inner humanity of their client. Torture of any kind, especially one that results in death, strips everyone of that humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. And we may have questions, as we've said. Rebecca Woodman, are you here? Okay, thank you.
Chair. I'm here as a lawyer who has decades of experience in representing death sentenced individuals on appeal and post-conviction, including during the warrant period leading up to an execution. There are citations in my written testimony that document what witnesses saw during the Kenneth Smith execution in Alabama, and I won't go into that, but the execution has been described as nothing short of torture, and those who witnessed it reported being traumatized by the experience. This committee should not accept the Attorney General's offer to accept this gruesome method of execution. Beyond the plain horror of the lethal gas method it contemplates, House Bill 2782 contains numerous constitutional deficiencies that will deprive prisoners of fundamental due process and substantially increase the risk of inflicting cruel, unusual, and torturous pain in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments and the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights. Indeed, passage of this bill would inevitably lead to costly and time-consuming legal challenges. For instance, the ambiguous language of the bill does not specify at what point the Kansas Supreme Court's final order to the district court issues and appears to contemplate only the resolution of state appeals and post-conviction proceedings. This creates unnecessary confusion and risks cutting off legally available avenues of relief in both state and federal court, as well as requiring additional litigation as prisoners may be forced to request stays of execution to ensure that they can pursue all available remedies. The warrant process itself in the bill may limit a prisoner's ability to pursue available legal claims once the warrant has been issued. The bill requires the district court to issue an execution warrant within 30 days after receipt of the so-called final order of the Kansas Supreme Court. The district court is then authorized to schedule an execution period within as little as 8 days following the issuance of the warrant, because the Secretary of Corrections need only provide the parties with 7 days notice of the selected date. This bizarre and compressed timing creates the very real possibility that a prisoner and his attorneys would have barely a week's time to seek a stay of execution to pursue otherwise routinely available federal habeas proceedings, while also attempting to assemble an executive clemency application and assert any challenges that cannot be brought prior to a scheduled execution, such as competency to be executed. In addition, provisions for post-conviction DNA testing are separate from direct appeal and post-conviction procedures and appear to fall outside the bill's contemplation. All of this is a recipe for wrongful execution, a mistake that cannot be undone. I just want to emphasize that the bill also problematically grants the Secretary of Corrections or the warden as his or her designee the unfettered discretion to change the substances administered in either lethal injection or hypoxia, as well as to modify the method of killing by hypoxia at any time he or she deems necessary. And the terms of the bill appear to allow a substitution to be made even during the execution itself. Kansas is not Alabama, and I urge this committee to reject this unnecessary, problematic, and troubling proposal. Thank you very much. I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Annie Lohendorf, I believe. If you would introduce yourself, thank you.
My name is Annie Lindorf, and I've been a sister of charity now for 58 years. And I am here today because my faith compels me to stand before you, because I am so concerned about the moral fiber of who we have become as a people. And my faith compels you to remind all of us that there's a God who holds all of us together in a oneness. We are a human family first and foremost. And I'm here to testify against House Bill 2782. How did I become a spiritual life companion for a young man who is accused of capital murder? because I simply said yes. And that yes has led me to bigger and bigger yeses along the way, and a stronger and stronger conviction and commitment to stand with him and his family, who I've all come to know and love in the years now that I have been with him. This whole journey for me just is a fine, fine reminder that none of us is ever, ever what we do. We are never our actions or our thoughts. Even though the penal system consistently seems to favor punishment, one life can never, ever replace another life.
And sister, if you'll just stick to the bill, we would appreciate it. Yep, thank you.
And that we can never dismiss the potential also for the life that someone still has within them. I became involved with Lisa Montgomery before her death sentence was given and before she was executed. And that was probably the most horrendous night of my life. And since then, on January 25th, we have executed Kenny Smith, who has just been talked about. And I have to urge you, recommend to you that you all look at how that man died. From what I know and what I've heard and what I've read, it was a horrific death. And I don't see how any of us, if we look at members of a human family together, we are united and we are one. We don't have the right to take another person's life that way. So I encourage all of you who are on this team, please look at your hearts, look at who you are, look at how you are a member of this human family. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you being here. We have opponent written: Rashid Hamby, Bay Scroggin, Celeste Dixon, Silly King, Jeffrey Daisy, Keith Edwards, Dr. Laura Giordano, Sean O'Brien, Robert Grass, and Sister Mary Lex Smith. So committee, please look at those. And I will now open up the hearing for questions for the opponents. Representative Owens.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think that what I've heard from the opponents is that the death penalty is inappropriate to them. So my question is this: we have doctors, we have attorneys, we have all different walks in opposition to this bill. The death penalty is not on debate today. We are called to decide how to fulfill the death penalty. If we are called to decide how to fill the death penalty and nitrogen hypoxia is not the right answer, then can someone tell me the humane way that we should do it? What is the appropriate way that Kansas should put someone to death? Because that is what we are called to decide here right now with this bill, whether this is an acceptable method to do it or it is not. And if not, then how? And I will open that up to anyone that cares to answer.
If you would,
the microphone, please.
Yeah, go ahead and come to the microphone and introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Representative Owens. My name is Caroline Zaschak. My husband, Brandon, spoke earlier. I am a capital appellate defender, but I'm here on as a personal Topeka and Kansan. You asked what would we suggest instead? And you are not wrong that from the opponents of this bill, you are hearing an undercurrent that we believe the death penalty in and of itself is unjust. But all of us know that we're not here today to debate the validity of execution. And we're also not here to solve that problem. We're here today to explain why this particular method, the hypoxia method, which is, first of all, not specifically nitrogen hypoxia and could be anything, is unfair and unconstitutional and below the state's moral reputation. This legislature has already decided that lethal injection is the appropriate method, and we aren't here today challenging that. So while I wouldn't personally say that's the appropriate method, we're not here to say that we're not here to say that lethal injections can't go forward. We're here to say that nitrogen hypoxia is not a valid moral or constitutional substitute. and that the bill simply provides lip service to the idea of swift humane without any checks making sure that that's true.
Thank you. Thank you. Representative Carmichael. Representative Carmichael, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for Dr. I believe it's Zivit. Is that correct? Or can you still hear me, sir?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Is there someone else that can answer your question?
Yeah, Madam Chair, my inquiry would be then of any of these opponents, he having been the only one that I've recognized as having a medical degree and medical expertise. But we heard the discussion between the Attorney General and myself concerning what hypoxia means. To paraphrase, the Attorney General indicated that it involved the replacement of one gas for another, and I suggested that no, perhaps suffocation would also fit within the definition. Can one of the opponents try to give us a legal or at least a medical, based upon their knowledge, definition of what hypoxia is, what it means? I know it's difficult, but we need someone to help us here.
You would introduce yourself. So.
Yes, I'm Rebecca Woodman, and I'm one of the opponents, and I'm a lawyer. So there's nothing in the bill that defines hypoxia, as you said. And the general definition of hypoxia is suffocation. And I think the bill has to be taken by those terms, that it means suffocation. And the bill itself gives the Secretary of Corrections to decide, without any oversight that I can see, to determine the method by which hypoxia will be administered. And as I stated in my testimony, that can occur conceivably at the time of the execution. The same goes for lethal injection drugs. This bill allows the Secretary of Corrections to substitute drugs if it anytime it deems necessary, he or she deems necessary. So that could happen as well at the time of the execution under the terms of this bill.
Follow up, if I might, Madam Chair.
Yep.
I'm looking at the definition from the Cleveland Clinic. We inadvertently heard what sounded like a definition from Alexa. And I'm sorry, I know this is serious, but I guess my point is it appears to be vague. And there are constitutional principles regarding vagueness. Could you try to explain to us how vague statutes imperil constitutional rights?
Yeah, and I think that's very apparent in this bill, because the vagueness doctrine that the Supreme Court has articulated in the death penalty context in particular, and I'm thinking in terms of the case of Godfrey versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court found a reversed death sentence because of the aggravating circumstance the jury found, which was a heinous, atrocious, or cruel aggravating circumstance, which was not further defined. And the court found that that aggravating circumstance could apply to any murder committed, and that it didn't serve the principles under the Constitution of narrowing the death eligible class. And that's a different context than what we're talking about here. But it's the same idea that you're not, that you're giving too broad of a swath to this method of execution. And the secretary has a lot of discretion under the statute to determine how a person should be deprived of oxygen.
So if by changing the statute today, do we run the risk that we create new appellate grounds, which would in fact delay the imposition of the death penalty for those on death row and the suffering of the victims of the crimes.
Absolutely. And that's what I tried to convey in my testimony. I mean, it was hurried, but these provisions are going to lead to more litigation, not less.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Owens.
Thank you for your indulgence on a second time. So a couple of thoughts along those lines, but then I'll turn to my original question. First of all, as I understand, suffocation stops CO2 expulsion and causes pulmonary acidosis. It does not. That is not the case with hypoxia. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, just trying to do a little bit of research as we go, and that didn't come from Alexis. It's also worth mentioning the statute allows secretary to elect which form of hypoxia, so whether that's nitrogen, helium, there are other methods that there could be something better than nitrogen, which is why I think this was left open. So to my question now, part of hearing a bill, we're hearing from the proponents and the opponents. We will at some point, I believe, be called on to work this bill, meaning we have the ability to amend this bill. We have the ability to change this bill. We had what I believed was an anesthesiologist. I really wish he was still online because I know he has the ability to put me to sleep painlessly because it's happened for a number of surgeries. And so I would love to have an answer from him on what his suggestion is, but I submit back to the audience yet again. Help me provide an amendment that will solve the issue at hand. Not whether we agree with the death penalty or not, but what is the most safe and humane way to accomplish it so that we can amend this bill and we can fulfill our obligation to perform the death penalty on those that have been charged once their appeals run out.
Well, what I will tell you, I'm not a doctor. I'm not qualified to make those decisions. But what I will say is I do know the Eighth Amendment. And what the Eighth Amendment requires is a fundamental respect for humanity. And it embodies the principle of the dignity of man. And any method of execution has to comply with that principle under the Eighth Amendment.
So which one does?
Well, from what we've seen of nitrogen hypoxia, which is not specified in the statute that has been proposed, in the bill that has been proposed. In fact, the bill doesn't even propose that hypoxia should be through a method of gas. So presumably there could be other methods of inducing hypoxia that the secretary has discretion to implement without any oversight. So that's a problem. But from Alabama is the only example we have. And by all accounts, that execution did not go according to plan. And the Attorney General contends it did go according to plan. But if that's true, then Alabama intended to inflict a torturous execution.
And I mean absolutely no disrespect, but I need a solution. I need someone to help me. And it seems like a lot of people are qualified to say that hypoxia is not the answer. So help me find the answer. Which one comes up to your merit? Do we go back to well, Utah still allows executions. Firing squad, is that the answer? I mean, where do we go? We have a death penalty. That's not up for debate. How do we exercise it?
Well, I don't want to be glib about this, but it's not my job to do that.
Precisely.
And so you're bound by the Eighth Amendment. That's what I am telling you. And so, you have to determine based on available data what is the best method of execution. I cannot tell you that. But what I can tell you is that the only example we have of administration of nitrogen gas hypoxia, is that it was prolonged, it was torturous, and it traumatized everyone who witnessed it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't prolong this any further.
Representative Miller, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you know, did
Alabama's statute mirror this one, or did it prescribe nitrogen hypoxia?
I believe that it prescribed nitrogen hypoxia, but I do not know the answer to that question for sure.
Well, if it did, then that does cause me concern about the issue you raised about unconstitutionally vague and prolonging these victims' suffering through a lengthy appeal only to find that we didn't do it correctly.
Representative Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if you're the right opponent for this, so whoever's appropriate to answer, but there's been a lot of talk about lack of oversight, but the bill does clearly say that the method has to be put in rules and regulations. There's a review process. There's the Kansas Judicial Review Act. There's a number of ways to challenge something that doesn't meet constitutional muster very specifically, and I suspect the first person that this is used on may want to challenge that regulation. So I just need some clarification on the level of administrative oversight that you say doesn't exist, because it seems like it does.
I don't know to what extent it exists, because under the statute's language, it simply says according to rules and regulations.
Right. My point is that there's a process to adopt those. They don't just automatically become law in Kansas. They have to go through multiple levels of review and are subject to challenge.
I don't see that that's clear under the statutory language, but if it is, then I stand corrected.
Representative Mon.
Madam Chair, actually, this is for Director Cessna. Thanks for being here again today. You talked about the cost of implementing this, but my understanding is that, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to correct me. By the time this decision and the execution is done, all the bids work and legal arguments are done and dusted and over, right? And so the method won't increase your costs at all, or am I wrong about that?
No, we pay for a variety of the different levels of representation, including through capital habeas. And so on the state level, and there's some of that crosses over with federal habeas, although the federal part of that is actually paid for, but it happens often simultaneously or back to back. And so the additional litigation and over the actual issues that are raised under this statutory language is what we have concerns are going to add to those costs significantly. My other concern that related specifically to the costs for our agency were also related to the impact of that additional method of execution and the issues that are raised that we've already discussed about the vagueness of that potentially being also contributing to the turnover and the amount of additional recruitment and training and all that kind of stuff that we have to do when we have to replace attorneys, when we have the impact that, like Mr. Barrett was talking about, with the trauma being involved in that system in the first place. That to the extent that this also, I think, is going to increase the likelihood of that impact on our turnover rates. That's also part of the concern of our fiscal costs there too.
Committee, are there any other questions? I don't have anyone else on the list. Okay, thank you, Heather. So with that, since there's no more questions, I will close the hearing on House Bill 2782. Thank you, everyone. Emotional topic. We appreciate everyone coming to give us your insight and your thoughts on it, and we will take it under consideration. And so, committee, we don't have meeting tomorrow. We will hear one bill and work some bills on Monday. And if we get done, we won't have a meeting on Tuesday, but we'll see if we get done or not. So All right.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you,
Madam
everyone.
Chair, do you have any idea what bills we might work on Monday so that we can contact the reviser if
No,
need be, but not
yes.
overwork the reviser with needless?
I will get an email to you all by tomorrow about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.